Hey y'all, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about chapter 14 in Lois Roman's CT technology for technologists. There's a lot of really helpful information here, but there's also some gaps. So I want to address some of those gaps, things that we need to know. If you're viewing this just for the purposes of the CT registry, this may be a little additional depth because they don't actually test you on radiation safety for the CT registry, which seems really odd to me. But we do need to be familiar with how radiation works within CT in order to best guide procedures. So why are we doing this? Well, I found this post to the ASRT communities a couple years back, and it still rings true. This technologist is being told that there's a certain amount of leakage radiation that's expected through the door of the CT room, and he's questioning whether or not that's actually safe. And so we frequently encounter these types of critical thinking questions when working in CT. And what I found through the years, I've been in CT for about 15 years, CT is one of those places where we get kind of accustomed to the amount of radiation that we're using, and getting comfortable with any amount of radiation is probably not a good idea. So what I'm saying is there's a consistent culture in CT that we should consistently question. So here's some learning objectives for our actual discussion today. I want to talk about radiation safety, just some basics of it, terms that we use when we're measuring CT dose. Some of this may seem like a bit of a review if you've had radiation biology in the past. We'll talk about how the beam geometry works, like the fact that we're accelerating an X-ray tube around the patient. That does influence the way that dose profiles work. We'll talk about how that's distributed throughout the patient, like the volume of tissue that we're examining. We'll talk about unique risks to pediatric CT examination, and really essentially why we should probably avoid pediatric CT examination if possible. And then we'll talk about ways to actually reduce patient dose. And anytime we reduce patient dose, chances are we're also reducing our occupational dose risk as well. And I want to just point out, this is an example here from industry of tube current modulation. And one of the, I have it here as a reminder to me that a lot of parts of CT dose safety actually are counterintuitive. So for example, this CT scan, the tube current is being modulated as a function of the amount of density of tissue that the beam has to penetrate as it moves through the thorax and into the abdomen. So how does it plan that? Well, it plans it off of the initial localizer images, so the Scouts or what have you, whatever machine you're working on, whether it's GE or Siemens, it works off of those localizer images in order to plan tube current modulation very often. And so sometimes technologists think, well, I won't do both localizers, that will save the patient some dose. But the reality is, oftentimes doing both localizers is necessary in order for tube current modulation to work best. So that is what I mean by how CT can be kind of counterintuitive. So it's helpful just to kind of start with the absolute basics of dose concepts, and that is where Lois Romans begins this chapter. And if I remember right, I may have been a first reader on this. I wasn't an editor of this textbook chapter, but I believe I did do a first read of it. So we need to understand both the benefits and risks of examinations, and what we want to do is take steps to maximize the positive and minimize the negative. And this comes from a lot of different sources. The ICRP, the NCRP uses this type of language. And so a lot of times what we're talking about in CT is not dose like minimization, but what we're talking about is dose optimization. So there's two components to this, and Lois Romans is correct to point out that when we talk about appropriate patient exam selection justification, that is ultimately the purview of the interpreting physician, the radiologist. So if we see a CT patient that looks questionable, the person we need to, the place where the buck stops is going to be the radiologist. We need to go and talk to them about, hey, I noticed we're doing this CT of the elbow on a 6-month-old kid, right? Do we really need to be doing this? And that justification question is best addressed by the radiologist. But what we can do, and where we should really kind of sit in the captain's seat on, is the question of optimization. How do we minimize radiation dose without without compromising diagnostic image quality. And that's a big balancing act, because the reality is I can reduce patient dose and give you crappy images with a CT scanner all day long. So we need to find that middle ground. And again, this will require some discussions with the health physicist, with the radiologist. Is this sufficient examination information? Is this a good quality image at this reduced dose? As well as knowing how the technology itself works. So let's transition just a little bit into talking about terminology. And this is something that a lot of people have kind of dug their heels in through the years. So we've got some antiquated terms that are sometimes called traditional units, and then we have the SI units. We'll be focusing completely on the SI units. First off, the first unit we need to think about is X-ray exposure in air. Exposure just means the amount of ionizations that are occurring in a given volume of air. This is really precisely measured in the SI system of units by a coulomb per kilogram, and that kilogram is a very precisely defined volume of air. I'm not going to get into exactly how it's defined, but we just need to know that it's measuring the amount of ionizations in air. Well, that's not particularly helpful if we're trying to figure out what's actually occurring inside the patient's body. A body is very different from air, and so that is why we use a unit of absorbed dose to talk about the ionizations that are actually occurring inside the patient's body. And really, this is a very complex concept. Anytime if you were to ask a health physicist what the patient's dose was from a radiation exposure, they would probably respond, "I don't understand the question," or "Dose to what?" Because dose is something that is very specific to different volumes of tissue. Different tissue types respond differently to ionization. But long story short, the SI units of measure are really nice in that we can transition from a unit of exposure, gray in air. We can speak about exposure in air, gray in air, or the amount of energy or work that's being done in air, and we can transfer that directly to gray in tissue. The traditional unit of measure was the rad, and we do not use that at all. But for the purposes of conversion, it's helpful to know that basically 1 rad equals 1 centigrade. And this should be, down here, this should be sub T, so it's generally written gray sub T. And that means gray in tissue, so amount of dose deposited in tissue, versus gray in air. So just another way to talk about exposure. So gray in tissue, talking about dose, gray in air, talking about exposure. So as you can see, these measurement terminologies get fairly complicated pretty quickly, and perhaps nothing more complicated than actually understanding what the effective dose is. I think about the effective dose as what the effects of the radiation would be on the patient. So to do this, we need to have weighting factors. We'll have a weighting factor for radiation. Sometimes this might be referred to as quality factor, but more often it's just the radiation weighting factor, or W sub R. And the nice news about that is that the weighting factor for X-rays is just 1. That's true for gamma rays as well. It's just 1. So we don't have to worry about the weighting factor being weird for the radiation. Like, for example, the weighting factor for alpha particles is 20, which is weird, right? Because you have to multiply stuff times 20 when you're exposed to alpha particles. One of the reasons we don't play with alpha particles in the diagnostic imaging department. But the weighting factor sub T, the weighting factor for tissue, let me zoom in just a little bit, differs depending on what manual you're looking at and what part of the body you're talking about, because we know that different parts of the body respond to radiation dose differently. So for example, the gonads have a much higher weighting factor, right, than other parts of the body. Like for example, the colon, right? Why? Because the gonads are more radiosensitive. Even less radiosensitive would be something like a surface of bone, right? So we need to understand that different parts of the body respond to radiation exposure differently, and that is part of what the effective dose is trying to capture. So the main thing that we need to understand is the effective dose is accounting for the effects of a particular to a particular tissue within the patient's body as it's absorbing a radiation exposure. We will need to know this formula in the fall when we get into radiation biology. I'm just going ahead and introducing it here so that we're familiar with this. This is a way of actually calculating the effective dose. You take the dose in gray, multiply it by the weighting factor for radiation, which in the case of x-rays is 1, and then multiply it by the tissue factor for whatever area of the body was exposed, right? And that's going to give you an amount in sievert, right? And that's how we would actually express effective dose. It would be expressed in sievert or oftentimes millisievert. That should be a SV for the abbreviation. Okay. Well, let's talk about how this dose is actually shaped across the volume of tissue that we're examining. And the reason I've got the little hot dog here is because we are not hot dogs. There are parts of our bodies that are kind of like a hot dog if you think about them in an axial view, and there's parts of our body that are more like a turkey leg or something like that if you think about it in the axial view. And the reason that's important is because the thickness of the tissue differs over the course of the area that we're scanning, right? So if we have a uniformity of dose, that would be great. But the reality is that the patient's body grows or shrinks in size as they move along the z-axis through the scanner tube. And so the dose distribution becomes less and less uniform. So for example, body scans are a lot less uniform than head scans because frankly, our heads look more like hot dogs. They are uniform, right? Versus looking like turkey legs. The body looks more like a turkey leg. You've got the chest that's really big, and then like the legs take up less volume, right? So that central dose is going to vary. That center point of around which the X-ray tube is spinning, the isocenter, the dose at isocenter in the case of CT, is going to be different, right? It's about 1/3 to 1/2 of the peripheral dose, the dose out at the skin. The largest dose will be superficial, it will be at the skin. This is one of the reasons why organ doses would be higher for children compared with a larger adult. Well, why? Because the x-rays have more to travel through to get to, like, for example, an adult's liver, right, than for it to get to a child's liver. There's just almost as though the tissue itself is working as a shield for the liver. So again, the turkey leg is going to be a better way to think about the body. Now, I know that this slide kind of messed up, so I'm just going to spin it around. Sorry. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of this comparison. This is more or less a cylindrical volume here, right? The head. And the dose is fairly evenly distributed around both the periphery and the internal portion of the scan. This is a much more irregular shape down here, this oval shape of the maybe the thorax or what have you. And so what we see is really strange dose distributions. We have significantly less dose at the center than we do out here at the tissue margin. Why is that? Well, because in part, the x-rays are having to travel through more tissue when they're coming in from the side in order to reach that isocenter. All right, there's an additional way that we need to think about the dose geometry, and that's why I've included this goofy Snapchat image here, is it kind of does this weird ghost thing as we're looking at it along the z-axis. So we're just kind of looking at the axial slice. Now we're thinking about the patient actually traveling through the exam tube, and as the CT tube rotates around the patient, we're getting these dose distributions that kind of tail one into the other. There's an example of this on page 174 in the textbook. There's an additional discussion of this around 176. So this is a considerable consideration anytime we're talking about CT dose, that some of the scatters to adjacent volumes of tissue. So this z-axis dose distribution is kind of irregular, and so we wind up with tails that contribute to approximately 25% to 40% of the total dose is just tailing. It's completely useless to us. Ideally, as she indicates in the book, we would love to see a dose profile along the z-axis that just follows this nice, neat volume square here, where each slice just receives some uniform amount. We do not like this out here. This is the problem, right? That kind of ghost thing there. All right, well, what are ways that we can actually measure this, given this overall complexity here, both with the changes in the volume of imaging, like with the patient thickness, and then also with this tailing effect that happens, this radiation penumbra. Well, we have to kind of think about things as averages, and we very oftentimes work in averages. Anytime when we're doing any kind of radiation dosimetry type consideration, we're working in approximates. The first that we would look at would be the multiple scan average, and this is just calculated off of multiple scans. So they do repeated analysis using a specific type of phantom. And then we say, okay, this must be approximately what's being received within the volume of tissue. This is then oftentimes used to calculate a CTDI, and this is what's actually reported to the FDA. And in all likelihood, if we go to some kind of standardized dose reporting in CT, it will be like the CTDI volumetric that we would use. So what is this doing? Well, the CTDI is actually taking some liberties with its calculations. For example, if we look on page 174, CTDI can only be calculated if slices are contiguous. That would mean that they would basically have a pitch of 1. So there need to be no overlap or gaps between the slices. So we just take the CTI, it's multiplied by the ratio of slice thickness to slice increment, in other words, the pitch, and we have a calculation of how that dose is distributed over a volume of tissue, right? This is not uniform, right? And so the CTDI is less than ideal, and it does not necessarily fully represent what was actually scanned, but it gives us an approximation for what the radiation dose would be to the volume of tissue. So basically it has to do with that area that was scanned. So this CTDI volumetric accounts for exposure variation along the Z direction or the Z axis. So it is trying to account for the scatter radiation from slice to slice. And it's independent of the scan length, so it's just telling us for each increment of the scan, here's what we would expect to see. It's the preferred method. Additionally, scanners will report a dose length product, and so this just takes the CTDI and multiplies it by the actual scan length. So of the two number, the DLP will be a much larger number, but basically all you're doing is just taking that CTDI volumetric and multiplying it times the area that was scanned. So for example, if the CTDI for a single slice was, I don't know, 0.005 or 0.02 or something, then you would multiply that by the length, right? The actual area that was scanned, so like 100 millimeters, right? And that would give you the DLP. So in terms of comparing dose and CT, this is very, very difficult to do. And it boils down to this. When it comes down to having really, really good low contrast resolution, the cost of that is fairly high radiation dose exposure to the patient. Well, just how high are we talking? Well, sometimes we compare this to things like natural background radiation, which can be helpful to the patient. But for our points of view as an X-ray tech or CT tech or what have you, we need to be thinking about what are we talking about in terms of like actual factors. And at the end of the day, CT scans are about 100 times more radiation than your average diagnostic X-ray exam. So it's not unusual for the surface dose to be much higher in CT as well, and there's really not a lot that we can do to shield the patient, if we're completely honest, and this is a point of controversy, because we're spinning the X-ray tube around the patient. And in fact, I mean, shielding is kind of controversial in and of itself right now. So let's put it in light of things like the NCRP report number, 160, looking at average background radiation exposure to the average U.S. citizen, right? So natural background radiation accounts for about 3 millisieverts of exposure annually. That's natural background radiation. The exposure from a chest X-ray is about 0.1 millisieverts, so significantly less than natural background radiation. Exposure for like a chest, abdomen, pelvis, which would be a pretty big CT exam, it's about 3 times natural background radiation. So that's another way for us to think about it. We are well above natural background radiation when we walk into the CT department and we're doing those exams, right? So I'm emphasizing this because, again, there is that culture within CT to become kind of accustomed to the amount of radiation that we're using, when really we should not become accustomed to the amount of radiation that we're using, because it is significantly higher than natural background radiation. Versus within the X-ray department, I think we can kind of, ease off a little bit on, freaking out about radiation exposure, because it is significantly lower than natural background radiation. All right, what are the controlling factors here, right? Well, we've already mentioned that radiation beam geometry is significant. Oftentimes we do scans that, require 360-degree rotation of the tube around the patient, when really all we need is about 180 degrees of rotation. Why the difference? The 180 degrees is going to require less radiation exposure, but the 360 degrees gives us prettier pictures, right? And that's what's going to boil down to a lot with a lot of these. Filtration. So it is helpful to remove some of the soft or low energy x-rays from the beam. So the purpose of filtration is largely within CT is twofold. First is to reduce patient skin dose by getting rid of those weak x-rays. And then also we can kind of shape the beam a little bit. So that's shaping of the beam is we're moving into the range of radiation therapy ways of thinking about the x-ray beam. But that shaping of the beam would be something like a bow tie filter, where less radiation is given to the periphery. Why? Because there's less tissue to penetrate at the periphery of the body. Detector efficiency. As we improve detector efficiency, we can reduce patient dose, right? Slice width and spacing, like we've already indicated in some of our discussions about technique, as we get smaller and smaller slices and we place them closer and closer together, we would expect radiation dose to increase. So it's a direct relationship. Pitch. As pitch decreases, radiation dose will increase. So it's a reverse or inverse relationship. Pitch is the distance that the table's moving through the tube. So basically I'm saying that the table's moving slower. So that's an approximate. The table's moving less, and so per scan, so the patient dose is going up. We're essentially increasing the time that they're inside the tube, or inside the gantry, I should say. And then also that scan field diameter. This is kind of related to like collimation within radiography. So as we increase that scan field of view, we are increasing patient dose. All right, so there's also considerations like mass and KVP. Frankly, they're kind of a can of worms when it comes to CT scanning. So I'm not necessarily going to, emphasize those one way or the other, because reality is with KVP increases in CT, oftentimes the patient dose increases as well, which is very different from other modalities like radiography. So I don't want people to get confused on that one. Patient size and thickness, of course, would, as we have a patient size increase, a body part thickness increases, we're going to increase dose, repeated scans, and collimation, kind of a no-brainer. And it is helpful to go back to this ACR material and kind of think about the ways to think about, these dose guides. Here's an example of maybe kind of a clinical scenario where they're reporting dose, right? So they've established a reference level for an adult head. It's 75 milligray, right? And then they've got a pass-fail level here, right? And so they are the technologists and the radiologists are working together to define, okay, this is what we would expect to see for most all scanning. If we see it go beyond that, then we need to notify a physician prior to initiating the scan. And I think this is a really good way to view dose. I think it could also guide dose reporting. Well, why all the concern? Well, again, this goes back to NCRP report 160, when we found that patient exposure was significantly increased with the advent of CT scanning, and CT scanning is kind of continues to lead the charge in terms of overexposing patients to radiation. So this is contributing to a disproportionate overall radiation dose from radiologic sources. And bear in mind, we are the only industry in the United States of America that is allowed to knowingly and intentionally expose U.S. citizens to radiation. Nuclear power can't do that. There's a lot of people who use radiation, and they cannot intentionally expose people to radiation. So this is not a small thing that we're allowed to do this as medical professionals. So we need to continue to put forward research. It would be wonderful if we had like a database where we could, house information about people's radiation exposure and keep records of people's radiation exposure over their lifetime, so we could know a little more about the low dose radiation exposures that we generally use in medicine. There's definitely a need for education, and when I say education and a need, I'm not just talking about educating our patients. I mean educating our fellow techs, educating physicians who are ordering. There's even needs for educating radiologists, because they don't necessarily understand all that our scanners are capable of. And so sharing information is good. Oftentimes there's some really great cases, not great, but scary cases you can look up, like Cedars-Sinai, brain perfusion at Cedars-Sinai, the case of Raven Knickerbocker, which we'll look at here for an activity in this class, where inappropriate scanning parameters were found. Oftentimes, I shouldn't say often, but there have been examples of manufacturers who produce CT scanners, and they had some kind of like base level operating parameters for the CT scanners that they shipped out with, and the technologists weren't aware of it because they missed the training or whatever, or maybe the training didn't even happen. And those base level values were actually over irradiating people, and technologists continued to hit the go button on these CT protocols that were systematically overexposing people. Of course, extra images, any kind of looky-loo type stuff, just overall lack of awareness. I think there's a little bit of almost some nihilism here, where we're just like, oh my goodness, that's a lot of radiation, and we just kind of stop caring, ironically. So that has to do with our perceptions of risk. And perception of risk is a significant thing. For example, some patients might be more concerned with the claustrophobia thing than other things. People become familiar with things, that there's a lack of understanding. Sometimes scientific uncertainty makes people just say, oh, well, it must not be a big deal. They're not sure what's going on, so not a big deal, right? Whether or not it's within our control is another way to think about risk. And then the impact on children. Oftentimes, if something is impactful to children, ironically, again, people tend to look the other way. They don't want to think about that because it's just kind of too stressful to think about how the risk might be influencing children. So two comparisons that I think are helpful when thinking about risk. I love the comparison that it's actually more risky to drive to the airport than to fly on a plane in terms of being involved in a crash or in an accident. You're more likely to have the crash in your car than you are flying on the airplane. But I feel much more anxiety getting on a plane than I do in a car. And that's in part because I don't think people were meant to fly. If we would have been born with wings, right? So there's a biological piece to that too. And then I think it's helpful to think about time. So this is yet another way to conceptualize risk. So natural background radiation is naturally occurring. It's all around us all the time, right? And our species has evolved in the presence of natural background radiation. So it's helpful to think about radiation exposure to natural background radiation in terms of time, right? And we can compare that to radiation exposure for a CT exam. So for example, the amount of natural background radiation that would equal an X-ray of the chest is about 2 weeks, right? But for a CT of the chest, it's about 2 years, right? So I think that time thing gives me a way to quantify it that makes more sense to most patients than talking about it in millisieverts and gray and things like that. So if you do have patients who have questions about risk related to the procedure, whatever those risks may be, the first thing you should do is try to identify what level of the risk they're concerned about. Is it the scientific uncertainty? Is it how this is out of their control. Is it related to they're unfamiliar with the equipment? So try to identify, do some homework, and try to figure out what part of risk are they worried about, and then try to express our rationale in terms that they can understand. And the rationale is essentially this: that there are benefits of this procedure. There's benefits of this exam. This exam today can tell us whether or not you've had a stroke, or this exam today can tell us whether or not there's a pulmonary embolism. That's very valuable. So that benefit far outweighs the risk of whatever radiation exposure may cause, 60 years down the road. Because what we're talking about, and we'll get into this more in the fall, is those long-term, stochastic or random effects of radiation exposure, i.e. cancer. So that's the risk and benefit thing. So the risk level associated with CT can be considered acceptable if, number one, the individual is aware of the risk. Today we are doing a CT exam. It involves exposure to ionizing radiation, right? The individual receives some commensurate benefit. The benefit of doing today's exam is we can figure out whether or not you're having a stroke, right? And three, everything reasonable has been done to reduce the risk. I'm going to take every measure that I can as your CT tech to keep the dose to an optimized level. And what I mean by optimize is I'm not going to just turn the dose all the way down, because then the pictures wouldn't be good. I'm going to find a place somewhere in the middle where we can still get good pictures at a relatively low radiation exposure. All right, with pediatrics, of course, the rules completely change and everything flies off the rails, right? It's going to be helpful to explain to both the parents and the child that there's a small risk involved, right? And the risk is related to exposing them to radiation. And you can compare it with the child. You can compare it to being out in the sun for too long and getting a sunburn. You're going to do everything you can, and they're not going to receive a sunburn today because you're going to do everything you can to protect them and keep them safe, right? Anytime we're using a CT scanner to examine a patient, who's a pediatric, who's small, we need to use specific protocols just for pediatric scanning. This is one of the reasons why there's pediatric hospitals, is they have those special protocols built. Frankly, some general hospitals do not have these protocols built. And so I've had to go into facilities and build pediatric protocols because they didn't have them, right? And that's part of what we're about in this class, is learning how to build those protocols. So we need to make efforts to decrease radiation dose by adjusting all the various factors prior to doing any kind of pediatric examination. And one thing to understand, right, is the CTDI is zero help on this one, right? This comes from the American Association of Physicists in Medicine, something like that. Sorry, I don't have the actual reference in front of me. So special considerations related to pediatric stuff is, of course, increased sensitivity. They're young and their cells are more susceptible to radiation exposure. There's going to be a higher effective dose because they're smaller, right? And we're using it more, right? And an additional problem is that the CTDI does not actually help. So if we look at these two different scenarios, scenario one, we did not make any adjustment for patient size. The CTDI reports 20 milligray. If we did make an adjustment for patient size, we turned down the mass for the pediatric patient. It dropped the CTDI in half, like we would expect. But what actually happened? Did the patient dose really increase or decrease, right? For CTDI, it's the same, but the smaller patient's dose is much higher, right? For scenario two, where we decreased the mass, the CTDI is smaller for the smaller patient, but the patient dose is actually closer to equal for both. So we can't just blindly rely on the CTDI to guide radiation dose considerations. Let's talk about the fetus. So the time that we are most concerned with is going to be from about 10 days after conception to 3 months of gestation. That is the most radiosensitive portion of the fetus's development, because that is a time of major organogenesis and rapid cell proliferation. So all those things increase the cell's potential for mutation and for even death in response to radiation exposure. So in general, we ask questions about last known menstrual period because we're trying to determine if we're in a sweet spot. And that sweet spot is basically about 10 days after the last period, right? That's going to be a time where even if there was conception at that time, in all likelihood, it's prior to attachment to the uterus, and so it's just kind of a make or break it time for the zygote. So we shoot for that window of within 10 days of the last known menstrual period. Anytime we've got a patient who is pregnant and in their final trimester, very oftentimes we need to just carefully weigh how CT examination should be done. So pulmonary embolism is a risk factor related to pregnancy. So if you're pregnant, you're more sedentary, you can throw a clot more readily. And so we do CTAs of the chest to rule out pulmonary embolism on pregnant women. We just shield their abdomen and limit the scan to the area of the thorax, the chest. And in all likelihood, whatever radiation dose the child receives is very, very small, and it's mostly due to internal scatter. And the benefit, again, is making sure the mother does not have a blood clot. So, nevertheless, CT is one of those professions where we have to work very interprofessionally. So, for example, with the CTA of the pregnant woman, well, it's helpful to work interprofessionally in an education point of view to ask questions like, well, have we done, for example, a ultrasound of the lower extremities for deep vein thrombosis, right? Because if they have a blood clot in their legs, they're going to receive the blood clot medication anyways. We don't need to do the chest CT. So perhaps an education point might be, what is the first line? What's the diagnostic criteria? Yes, we may need to do a CT, but does it need to be the first line of exams that we do, or could we do an ultrasound for deep vein thrombosis on a pregnant patient? So understanding those kinds of justification questions are helpful for navigating the CT interprofessional communication dynamic. But in terms of like actual optimization questions, it boils down to adjusting mass to the patient size, the individual patient, using automatic tube current modulation whenever possible, avoiding increased KVP because it does do some weird stuff in CT, increasing the pitch, right, because that spreads the dose out and avoids some of that tailing effect, and limiting the use of thin slices to just those areas that need it. Additionally, I don't know that this textbook chapter touches on it. If it does, it's very briefly. Briefly talks about newer reconstruction methods, very, very briefly. But this is a significant thing that iterative reconstruction can significantly reduce patient dose while at the same time maintaining image quality. There are some special considerations with iterative reconstruction, and if you are interested in that, I would just refer you to a lengthy article that I've written on this for the ASRT. You could just look up CT iterative dose reconstructions. I'll put a link to a citation below in YouTube. All right, strategies for reducing dose continued. We want to limit the repeat scans. This is kind of the no-brainer ones. The iterative reconstruction methods I already mentioned. Verify that the CT is clinically indicated. This is one of the reasons why I check patient blood pressure prior to CT scanning. Patient has a headache. Do we need to do a CT scan? Well, what's their blood pressure, right? That's a good question. I've had patients that come in for CT of the head for headache, and for whatever reason, the ordering physician's office never checked their blood pressure. So making sure that we're actually doing the right exam prior to scanning. And then customizing CT exam to the patient's needs whenever possible. Shielding continues to be very, very controversial. One thing that I will say for certain, I've kind of read quite a bit about whether or not we need to be doing shielding on a patient. There's an example on page 185 of the textbook on what shielding looks like for a patient. Is make sure that you do not do what this tech did and place the shield on the patient during the scout imaging. Don't do that. If you're going to shield a patient for CT exam for any reason, shielding the surface anatomy like the breast tissue or the thyroid, do your localizer images. Because again, that's what the automatic tube current modulator is based off of, is the localizer images. Do the localizer images without shielding. Then before initiating the actual CT scan, go in and place the shields and do the CT scan. So again, kind of confusing, but very important thing that's evolved from the research in the literature. So there's definitely a need for ongoing research. So I'm just going to refer people back to the summit on CT dose. Helpful stuff. You'll notice we are really far down on their estimation of how well we're doing with CT. We haven't even really started. We're at level 0. We're not reporting this stuff. We don't have a database, etc., etc. This is clearly something that needs to be on the forefront of people's minds. And I think one of the ways to think about that is how that ties into money. Because X-ray tubes, especially the ones that we use in CT, are expensive. So reporting dose, once managers understand that reporting dose can actually help us be more efficient in our use of the CT tube, because the tubes are expensive, and the electricity that we use to run the CT tube, then we might actually start to see ourselves move up this line here. But generally, we just talk about it in terms of risk, and the risk is so strange to try to quantify, like I've struggled to do throughout this lecture, that people just kind of lose it. So I mostly just talk about, hey, it will save us money, right, to reduce patient dose and improve image quality. There's a great ACR white paper on this as well. Thank you so much. Like and subscribe down below, and shoot me your comments and questions. Bye.